Hi and welcome back to another video. We are talking Natasha Denona's I Need a Nude palette. I was so excited when this launched. Literally the day it launched in the UK, I put my order in on Cult Beauty and I've been playing with the palette for around a week now, so I thought I would come on and give you a quick review comparing it to some of my cheaper palettes. So the reason actually I wanted to make this video was not only because the palette is gorgeous, but actually because I'm a huge fan of the Drugstore. Majority of my palettes are Drugstore. I think I've got a couple of Charlotte Tilbury palettes and I've got one palette from Iconic London, but the rest are Drugstore. So I really feel I'm in a great position to kind of compare these high-end palettes with the unbelievable value that you can get on the Drugstore and let you know, is it worth splashing your cash on Natasha Denona? So in this video, I'm going to be using Natasha Denona on one eye and a much cheaper brand on the other eye. The difference in price is astonishing. I'm actually wearing different eyeshadow on each eye right now. I'm not sure if you can tell which one is the Natasha Denona palette and which one is the absolute bargain Drugstore brand, but I will show you now over in the eyeshadow tutorial. So it's application time. We're going to go in with the Natasha Denona eye first and then match it on the other side with the cheaper palettes. So to begin with, I'm going to go in with the shade Fair just to add a nice base for the eyes. So going in with a fluffy brush and just applying that shade almost up to the brow bone. Now we don't get much pigment out of this, but it just kind of evens out the colour of the eyelid. Then we're going to go in with the shades Tender and Vague. So I'm going to combine these two actually to go into my crease, just so we get the colour that I'm looking for because it matches the other palettes that I've got, and kind of work that just above the crease to add some definition to the eye. I don't want it to be too warm, which is why I've mixed kind of a cooler shade in with that sort of rosy red. So you can see that has some really nice pigment to that. It's definitely added some depth to the eyelid. And for the focal point, I'm going to go in with this beautiful shade Muse, which I think is probably the most kind of foiled, shimmery shade in the whole eyeshadow palette. So I'm going to dip my finger in lightly and apply that to the centre of the eyelid. And I mean, that is such an insane finish. So I'm literally just patting that in rather than spreading it, just in the centre of the eye. You only need the smallest amount. And then to finish the glimmer, I'm going to go in with the shade Sheen just towards the inner corner. And then we'll move into the under eye section. So this is a lot lighter. It's nowhere near as shimmery and it's quite nice to kind of bring in towards the inner corner. Just adds that slight shimmer, nice and lightweight, just like this. So I'm going to go in with those first two shades again, so Tender and Vague, and just kind of bring that along the under edge. So I'm going to pinch my brush and just give some definition under the eye, bringing that look together. And then I'm just going to add some shimmer towards the inner corner of the eye. So I'm going to go in with Sheen again. So to finish everything off and bring everything together, I'm just going to do a tiny bit of liner. I'm going to go in with this shade here, which is the darkest shade Silhouette, just to create a little line towards the end of the eyelid. Okay, so now is the bit I'm excited about. We're going to compare that palette to two palettes which both retail at £3.75. These are the MUA £5 palettes. The top one is Desert Bloom and the bottom one is Neutral Wanderlust. So this is not a dupes video at all. You can tell that these colours are not dupes of the Natasha Denona palette, but they are more nude shades. We've got the kind of pinky nudes and then the neutrals, which are more like brown tones. So essentially, I'm going to use both these palettes to try and create a similar look on the other eye, just because the foils and shimmers in these are insane, and I do think we'll be able to create a really similar look. So just like the Natasha Denona palette, I'm going to be going with this shade here from the Neutral Wanderlust palette all over the lid. Obviously with this one you don't get a mirror, which is kind of what you would expect with a cheaper palette. So the pigment on this right off is so much more than the Natasha Denona palette, but I do also know there is a bit more fallout. I could see kind of some powder flying off the brush. but obviously with a light shade like this, it doesn't really matter. And in my crease, I'm going to be going with this shade and this shade, so mixing those two together to create a colour for my crease. So they are extremely similar to the two Natasha Denona shades, and just going above my crease and into the outer edge. This probably isn't going to be exactly the same colour, but I would say near enough. And again, I'm finding the pigment here is a lot stronger, which I guess in some ways makes the palette a little harder to work with. So you can see here that it's not quite blended as well, and I think that's because it's more pigmented, so it's a little harder to work with and maybe not so beginner friendly. So what I'm going to do is go in with that light shade again, kind of to even things out a little bit, so bringing that all around my brow bone just to sort of soften that, which obviously we didn't need to do on the other side. And then in terms of shimmers, I'm going back into Neutral Wanderlust and using the two foils here. So this is for the kind of inner corner and this is for the centre of my eyelid. And I'm simply going to pat that right in the centre. So the main difference I can see is that this is, again, more pigmented, but it's also less wet look, more foil look. But the overall result is extremely similar. I can't believe it actually. Well, that blended effortlessly. And to finish up with, I'm going into this shade here, which isn't quite as dark as the Natasha Denona liner, but we'll work with it. And we're just going to bring that to the outside edge and slightly wing it out, but not too much. And again, applying so incredibly easily. And then we'll move into the base, combining the same shades as I used on my eyelid and exactly the same as the Natasha Denona side. So I'll get on and do that now. So this is the finished look. We've got two £3.75 palettes combined on this one, and then on this side we've got the Natasha Denona £65. I'll come in a little closer. So would you be able to tell which side was which? This side is £65 Natasha Denona. This side is two £3.75 palettes. I'm going to pop my mascara on so we can see the finished look, and we'll talk a bit more about the palettes in detail. So makeup applied, and we can chat a little bit more about the palettes, specifically Natasha Denona. So one thing I'd say is that I'm a little bit disappointed that the palette isn't that pigmented. Like none of the colours are that pigmented. And obviously that is a blessing if you want a really blendable look, but I do find you have to really, really build it up. And the swatches that you see online, in my opinion, aren't that realistic. So kind of all the advertising show the palette as being a lot more pigmented, the shimmers being a lot more kind of, had a lot more depth in them, being a lot more foiled than they actually were. And I haven't found that to be the case. However, I do still love this palette. I absolutely adore the colour story, and I do really like how twinkly the shimmers are. So one thing I talked about when I was popping the eyeshadow on was the Natasha Denona side was a lot more kind of wet look, twinkly, and I think that's really sophisticated, whilst the cheaper side was more of a kind of foiled look, which gave it a lot more depth, and I do like both for kind of different occasions. I would like to have seen more variety in the kind of shimmers in the Natasha Denona palette. Found this one definitely had kind of like the most impact, gives the most in terms of kind of colour and shimmer. I've also found that the mattes are quite hard pressed, which isn't a huge issue to me, but I just hope that this won't cause any problems later down the line and I'll still be able to get pigment from the palette as I continue to use it. Okay, so these are two of the foils from the MUA palette, and I'm just going to swatch them for you. Now these melt into my skin completely differently to the Natasha Denona palette. We get so much more pigment. I honestly can't believe the quality for £3.75. So in terms of swatches, comparing the two, I think the swatches from MUA are a lot more impressive. But obviously we don't have that wet look, we don't have that twinkle, we don't have the colour story of Natasha Denona, which is what I fell in love with. So I just realised that I still had my hair clips in. So would I buy Natasha Denona again? I honestly don't think I would buy another Natasha Denona palette again unless I loved the colour story. Absolutely glad that I bought I Need a Nude. If I could return it, I would not return it because I as I say, I absolutely love the colours. I'm really in my cool girl era at the moment in terms of tones. Even though I'm wearing some warm tones today, I love cool tones, and for me, this palette really allows me to explore that in such a pretty way. So, do you have the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette or any other Natasha Denona palettes? I would love to hear your thoughts on this palette or her other palettes. Do you find similar issues with pigmentation? How does it last on you? How does it compare to your other palettes? I really hope you found this video helpful and hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for joining. Bye.